Well, let's get to our panel right now. With me here in Washington is Afshin Molavi. He is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a political analyst with China Radio International. Joining us from Shanghai is Martin Jacques. He is a senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University, and he's the author of the international bestseller When China Rules the World. With me here in the studio too is Sourabh Gupta. He is an Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Analyst, and he's a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Qinduo, let me start with you. As Nathan, our reporter, just pointed out, this was a relatively short speech from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang, but it was a comprehensive address. He covered a whole range of issues. But I want to ask you about the one issue that everybody's focusing on at the UN, and that is the DPRK nuclear issue. What did you make of what the minister had to say?
Well, I think it's a bit surprising. He mentioned about there's still time for peace. Obviously, the Chinese side view the situation on the Korean Peninsula is very grave, and is time is pressing to take action, to press for dialogue instead of the other direction, that is confrontation and even to war. Given what has been talked about by President Trump about totally destroying North Korea, and of course there's a strong response from North Korean side. The latest, reported by the South Korean media that basically Kim Jong-un talked about, this deranged U.S. total, and he's going to tame derange the President Trump. So we don't know what kind of response he's going to take to such remarks, but obviously, it's not the right direction. So China again stresses this dual track method. That is, on one hand, countries should press for the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. On the other hand, peace efforts should be made between North Korea and the South and the United States.
That's right. There was a response in the last few hours from the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un to that speech by Donald Trump at the United Nations earlier this week, and the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un saying, or describing Donald Trump rather, as being deranged, and saying that he will pay dearly for his threats. Martin Jacques, a very different tone, a very different message from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He said there has to be a negotiated settlement. The difference couldn't be starker, could it?
It could not. There is no question at all that China's view of the DPKR situation and the Trump's view are at stark contrast. The Chinese position is to emphasize the importance of a diplomatic solution, to find ways to achieve a diplomatic solution and at all costs to avoid war. And on the other hand, Trump's speech, I think in a quite extraordinary way, put right at the center the possibility of war, of military intervention, of total destruction of North Korea. And I think that it's very difficult to see our way through this situation. I just would add one point, and that is that my own worst fears about Trump, to be frank with you, are being confirmed. I mean, the direction of travel on a range of issues, but particularly the withdrawal of America, a nationalistic withdrawal from agreements and so on. There is clearly a line of direction here, and it is continuing.
Afshin, we have the Chinese Foreign Minister talk about a negotiated settlement, a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I'm wondering to what extent that speech by Donald Trump actually made it more difficult for a negotiated settlement, because we would have people in Pyongyang, in the DPRK, saying, how can we negotiate with someone who wants to wipe us off the planet?
I think it does. I think it does make it more difficult. And I thought it was interesting that the Chinese foreign minister referred to the six-party talks, but it's hard to imagine a six-party talk situation now. Look, we expect the North Korean leadership to make outrageous statements. That's what they do. We expect more from the American president, right? And when the American president makes a statement like this, he feeds an already paranoid North Korea leadership, and it makes it much more difficult, I think, to have the kind of six-party talks that the Chinese foreign minister was talking about.
So I'm talking about a denuclearized Korean peninsula that Foreign Minister Wang talked about in his speech, it means that the DPRK has to give up its nuclear program, its missiles, its nuclear weapons that it has already. How easy or how hard is that going to be?
It's going to be very, very, very hard. But I would say, as the Chinese do say also, that it is not impossible. It will take decades, though, because even if we do arrive at an agreement, as we've seen with the Iran agreement, a subsequent president might want to renege on it. If North Korea does enter into an agreement on denuclearization or something on those lines down the line, and let's be clear out here, on July 4th, Kim Jong-un did say that he would place his ballistic missiles and his nuclear program on the table of negotiations. But of course, all the hostility, et cetera, had to be dropped. But he did place it there, at least.
That part is always left out of reporting here, that condition.
Exactly.
If the United States stops its hostile statements, its hostile stance towards us, then I'm prepared to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even in the best case scenario, if we do come to some form of agreement like the six-party talk, the September 2005 agreement, we are talking in terms of a multi-decade process to build confidence in that process being successful. So it's a very long road, but one has to be optimistic and one has to stay patient.
And I guess one would also, at some point, have to see some kind of, I guess, non-aggression agreement.
Absolutely, that has to be paired with it, and it must go beyond that. It's not just a non-aggression agreement. Of course, they have to have a peace treaty which formalizes the end of the Korean War. They then have to have some sort of a peace mechanism which thereafter integrates North Korea also into the international system. But also we must, while we do talk about all this, we have to say at some point of time, Kim Jong-un needs to signal very clearly at what point of time nuclear testing and ballistic testing is at least taken off the table, frozen for a considerable period of time. There's no inkling of that so far. And that has also been a real problem to getting to some sort of a negotiated situation.
Qinduo, the foreign minister, I mean, he addressed a wide range of issues, hot-button issues around the world, hotspots, if you like. Let's take a listen to some of what he had to say. Let's watch.
China is an anchor of world peace. Sustained stability in a country with over 1 billion people is an enormous contribution to world peace. Aggression is never in the genes of the Chinese, and acts of colonizing or plundering others are nowhere to be found in China's track record. President Xi has solemnly pledged that no matter how advanced it gets in development, China will never seek hegemony, expansion, or sphere of influence.
So there we heard there, the foreign minister saying China's not going to be seeking a sphere of influence. It doesn't want to get involved in other parts of the world. It's a question that I put to Martin Jacques, Qinduo, and that is, how different was the tone of this speech from President Trump's?
Well, obviously, China is looking forward with more open-mindedness, let's say. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's really about the connectedness, more trade and investment. You can almost describe it as a new style of globalization. And also, I think Wang Yi is responding to some of the accusations like against China of so-called new colonialism in terms of its relationship with African countries, its investment and trade in African countries. And of course, I think he's referred to the Chinese achievement, for example, like 700 million people being lifted out of poverty over the past 4 decades. Definitely, that's a contribution to poverty reduction overall globally, and also, let's say, contribution to, say, peace and stability in this region.
Martin, there were 2 things about that part of the speech that struck me. One was China is an anchor of peace, and China is not seeking a sphere of influence. How significant were those things?
Well, I think they were very significant. I mean, what the Chinese are trying to emphasize is that they will be a very different kind of great power to the experience we've had, for example, with the United States. That their emphasis is on development, especially for the developing world, which is home to 85% of the world's population, and that this requires mutuality and connectivity in a way which engenders cooperation and relies on cooperation in the world. And so the Chinese outlook is very different. And actually, you know, it's quite true. Wang Yi's speech is extremely optimistic. And I think rightly so, because I think the Chinese contribution to world development over the last 30-odd years has been enormous. The problem is that America is going in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, this is a really good point, an important one. I mean, you know, the foreign minister talked about emerging markets. He talked about globalization and almost a globalization 2.0, where it's not a Wild West globalization. But he really talked about sustainable development. And if you look around the world, as our colleague noted, 85% of the world lives outside of Northern America and Europe. That world wants decency and dignity and, you know, an economic opportunity. And for a world power like China to be speaking that language, I think it contrasts quite sharply with the world power in the United States and what language that President Donald Trump was speaking.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break right now. Much more to discuss about China and the United Nations General Assembly when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.